Good evening. Hello, thank you for coming. I'm Anne McLean from the library's music division, and we're very excited to welcome back one of the world's great early music ensembles, renowned for 35 years of extraordinary music making, Concerto Köln. It's a pleasure for me to introduce cellist Alexander Scherf, who's the general manager and artistic director, and my colleague Carolyn Ward-Bamford, who many of you know, curator of instruments here at the library. And we just had an amazing afternoon, a brief afternoon exposure for the instruments to these great players, and I'll let them talk about that in just a second. We're looking forward tremendously to what I know from experience is going to be a dazzling evening. And we want to talk about this very interesting program, which is an elegant construction. It's sort of like a set of variations on the concerto form. And we have works coming up, Handel, Bach, Vivaldi, Locatelli, Geminiani, great violinists writing great music that influenced violin writing till today. So, but to start with, why don't you both talk a little bit about this afternoon's visit with our Cremonese instruments?
We had an amazing visit. At least I did. I hope you did too. The group came in a couple of hours ago, honestly about 2 hours ago, and we were in here. And at first, I thought just the cellist was going to try the cello from the Library of Congress collection, and suddenly we just had glorious sounds coming from the instruments. And I have to thank you so much for bringing the group in. The violin players tried our instruments, and the reason why they tried them is because recently we put some of our Stradivari instruments in a different setup. You're used to hearing them in a modern setup with a bridge and steel strings. And in January, we had a program here with the Smithsonian called Haydn 2020, where through a generous donor at the Smithsonian, we were able to put gut strings and classical or baroque bridges on some of our instruments. And so today, when you showed up, it was one of our first times really to hear the instruments with your group, which is so phenomenal, the combination, the sound. And so I want to thank you for that. And before we get more into our instruments, tell me, what instruments do you have in your collection?
Yeah, thanks for having us, that we can come back to the Library of Congress. This is really an honor, and thanks for admitting us to have an insight and try out the wonderful instruments of your collection. We aim for an original sound like the composers in the 18th and early 19th century would have in mind with the instruments. So it's a mixture between original instruments from this era and newly built modern instruments which are modeled after original models of the 18th century. So one of our concertmasters, Shunsuke Sato, he plays a early Flemish violin, which is on loan by a Dutch society, I think. And whereas Mayumi, the other concertmaster, she's playing a modern violin, but of course it's built after Baroque principles and after a Baroque model. So it's a blend between the original material and newly built instruments after historic models.
So that brings us back to today when you showed up. Let's start with the cello.
Yeah.
That you will hear tonight. He will be playing our cello.
Yeah, the cello is the Casablanca Stradivari. And as I understood, it's the first time since ages that there is an original gut string set up on this cello with a historic classical bridge. So this is wonderful to think of, that this might come close to the sound as Stradivari and his contemporaries would have heard that cello. And it's such a released and relaxed and free and warm sound, and I think it's part of the principle of the gut strings and the lower pitch, because it takes away some stress from the instrument. and it's not so much pressure on the bridge compared to the modern metal strings, and this makes a really relaxed and big sound. So you can hardly tell that they are gut strings. What happens to my mic? So you can hardly tell that there are gut strings on it. It sounds as brilliant and big as a modern concert instrument, and this is an amazing experience to me.
It's true. It does sound that way. Do you find that a lot of modern players today on the cello might prefer the gut strings?
I mean, there's a change of taste in the last years. I mean, Stephen Isserlis, he was always fond of gut strings, playing on gut strings, and the gut strings love him. So he could even play a Shostakovich concerto in the Royal Albert Hall in London on gut strings, and you could hear him against a modern, big-size orchestra, which is really amazing. So there are more and more soloists who appreciate the warm and rich sound of gut strings again, luckily.
So our cello is from 1697, the Castle Barco, and also on the program tonight, one of the violinists is going to play on our Castle Barco violin from 1699. Again, in a different setup than it's been used to. For as long as I know, these instruments have not been in this setup. They have not been performed this way. Of course, they were once that way, and possibly when they first came here in 1935, they were that way.
Yeah, you have to imagine that the use of gut strings was quite common till the Second World War, and only after the 40s and the 50s, the metal strings came in use. So I think the Concerto Köln Orchestra in Amsterdam was the last orchestra to change from gut to metal, not until the 60s or 70s. So this was, but we lost this knowledge about playing on gut strings and producing gut strings completely. So the producers of strings had to learn this craftsmanship again. And imagine in those days of Vivaldi and Bach, the strings were more expensive than the actual instrument. The instrument was a piece of wood, and this was craftsmanship. And the gut strings, I mean, it takes, I think, like 20 or even 30 guts, I mean, animal intestines to have a double bass string. And I think for a cello, it's on the bass strings, it's like 10 or 12 animals you really need for that. And this was really expensive in those days. So the strings were really precious, and the instruments, okay, yeah.
And then also tonight, you will hear one of our violas in the same setup. And again, there are musicians on the viola now preferring the gut strings. Yeah,
you're quite right. Even, I mean, especially with string quartets, because this is the sound of gut strings is maybe not that big as the modern metal strings, but it blends more, and the overtone spectrum is richer than those of the metal strings, and gives a variety of colors to it, and I really do appreciate that.
I think you'll definitely hear this tonight, the way they blend in the auditorium, especially in our Coolidge auditorium. It is just a seamless, gorgeous sound that you're in from rehearsal.
So the three of the players and you, right? We have four altogether, 4 instruments tonight, and that's that are being used.
The Castle Barco violin, the Castle Barco cello, the Tuscan viola.
Wonderful. You know, I found this quote about how this ensemble is called the silver-toned Rolls-Royce of period ensembles, and I was thinking particularly tonight, this is very apropos. Well, let's talk about the program which you put together, which is beautiful. And I was curious, do you travel, first off, do you travel with 4 violinists very often? I would think this is unusual. Here.
So, I mean, we do travel with violins, but not with 4 violin soloists. This is something, I mean, really something special, that we take, let's say, 4 concertmasters with us. I mean, Concerto Köln is a fairly international orchestra. I mean, we're based in Cologne, in Germany, but we travel a lot, and our concertmasters, I mean, there's Shunsuke Sato, he is from a Japanese family, but grown up in the US. Mayumi from Japan, Evgeny Sviridov from St. Petersburg in Russia. And there's Jesus Merino, a young Spanish violin player who is just new to our ensemble. And this makes it a different blend again. And what we wanted to show is the development of the Italian concerto form. And of course, Vivaldi is one of the key figures of the concerto form. And the new thing to this Italian model was the juxtaposition of a small concertino solo playing ensemble against the tutti, the ripieno full orchestra. And probably this came from the Venetian choir tradition, where they had several choirs in the Marcus Cathedral with different sizes. And I think Giuseppe Torelli was the first one to compose systematically with a concertino and a tutti, and of course Vivaldi. And this came à la mode, and we know that Vivaldi, he loved to arrange pieces by Torelli and by Vivaldi, and especially the concerto for four solo violins in B minor we're going to play tonight. There's it's an arrangement by Johann Sebastian Bach for 4 harpsichords.
In fact, arrangements is a theme throughout this. By the way, the textures in this program are wonderful, and it varies, between solo, ripieno, 4 violins, 2 violins, and these are true crowd pleasers, that's for sure. Yes, you'll see. But in terms of arrangements, this is a theme throughout too. The Bach arrangements and the Vivaldi. He made something like 9 or 10 of them, of Vivaldi arrangements of his own. And then, of course, Geminiani was so known for those that he almost became, his own music almost became overshadowed to some degree. So I was going to ask you to talk about the two, the Locatelli and Geminiani, because each of them, particularly as violinists, as artists, but also as writers of great treatises, are so influential. Give some background on
Talking about Francesco Geminiani, he's not such a big name nowadays compared to his contemporaries Bach and Handel, which the reason might be that his output is very, very little. He didn't compose any operas. And his work consists of 3 or 4 collections, oeuvres, all instrumental music, mainly violin, virtuoso repertoire. Geminiani, he was a virtuoso player. And by the way, in those days in the Baroque, only those musicians were considered to be a real musician who were able to compose and to improvise. So all of them were actually instrumentalists in the first point, and only after that they would compose mainly for their own use. And Geminiani, he was from Lucca in Italy, and we know that he has taken up the position of concertmaster in Naples at the opera orchestra, but only for a couple of months, 3 or 4 months, and we wonder why. And I think what I read about Geminiani, he was a maniac somehow. He was over the top, he was crazy, and his colleagues couldn't follow his instructions and his bow strokes. And you will notice that in his music, especially the late concerti, we recorded them, it's not anymore the 4-movement structure, slow, fast, and it consists of episode, it's rhapsodic, and there are concerti by Geminiani which consists of 13, 14 very little scenes, so to say. So it's a epic landscape, and this is something very special. And so his late works were not understood by the amateur music societies, although there are prints. And we know that Geminiani, he played together with Handel for King George in those days. So by his colleagues, he was considered a big composer, a very interesting composer.
And there's so many connections like that between among the composers on the program. You just were saying Handel, the Handel harpsichord concerto that you've chosen. This is a piece that was played in between other concerti by Handel himself. It was like an occasional piece sometimes. And in terms of the going back to the Bach and Vivaldi connection, I was I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because you always hear that Bach took a lot from Vivaldi, and you don't know exactly what it was maybe. But a couple of things popped up today that were interesting, and I wondered if you had read about this. One thing was that Bach may have the employer at the time, the princely court in Weimar. That prince may have gone to Amsterdam, where they just published L'Estro Armonico, and that seems a little apocryphal, but it's kind of fascinating. That's sort of a concrete bit of information. What do you hear about that?
Yeah, I read this also, and I know that the Prince of Weimar, he went to Amsterdam, and there was Roger and Le Chêne who published Prince, musical Prince in Amsterdam, and we know that Vivaldi, he took Vivaldi to Weimar, and this is probably why how Bach learned about this music. Also, Mattheson, Johann Mattheson, musicologist, he brought the pieces by Torelli to Bach, and Pisendel. Pisendel is an important name. He was a violinist in Dresden, at the Dresden court, and he was student of Giuseppe Torelli when Torelli was in Germany. And so Bach had all those scores in his library. And the Bach double concerto we're going to play tonight, this is pure Italian music, basically, but through the intellectual eyes of Johann Sebastian Bach. This is Italian music, basically, and especially the slow movement, the Siciliano, is Italianità, cantabilità, and again the juxtaposition of a lively concertino and the tutti.
And another thread going through there is Locatelli, because he was one of the people that, as I understand, Bach chose to program that composer on his coffeehouse orchestra programs in Leipzig, which are so fascinating. And I've been reading it's kind of amazing that John Butt was here recently, the scholar and organist, and he was saying that Bach basically worked his way into the position of the leader of the Collegium Musicum. He didn't start out with that necessarily. It wasn't part of his contract, but he did slowly begin to take over this role, and it really broadened his world as a civil servant in the city of Leipzig. But the interesting thing is just that he was able to program something like 500 concerts, and Locatelli was one of those. So did you think of these kinds of connections when you made the program?
Yes, we do. I find that really interesting. For me, it's hard to imagine Bach in the coffee house. In those days, women were not allowed to go to the coffee house, the Café Zimmermann, except for the musical academies, the Collegium Musicum. And you always think of Bach as the composer of the St. John's Passion, the Matthew Passion, and you wouldn't think him entertaining in a coffee house.
No, you don't.
But he did that regular seasons. And he took that over from Telemann, who founded the Collegium Musicum in Leipzig in those days. And that might be the reason why he arranged and rearranged many pieces of his Cöthen and Weimar time to have a repertoire for the coffee house sessions. And of course, he changed sacred music into profane music, and had a sacred cantata with a different text, and it became the coffee cantata. And this is this was a recycling procedure, which was not suspect in those days. I mean, we think about copyright and copy and paste mistakes, and you've refused your doctorate because you did copy and paste. But in those days, it was common practice. And when Bach arranged pieces by Vivaldi, it was an homage to the Italian composer, and was an honor to be arranged by one of your fellow composers.
You know, we want to find a little bit also about your modern activities, and Carolyn and I were talking about the Wagner readings you're doing, but just before leaving maybe this, I wanted to ask you about the La Folia, which everyone loves. That's just so famous, and so many composers had a crack at it, and so on. And I wanted to ask you if you, or were you familiar, these are all new, Beethoven, Berlioz, Brahms, Liszt, all worked with this too. I didn't know that. I knew about the Italian, the well-known ones, Corelli and so on. But apparently many Romantic period composers also worked with this.
The work with the Folia model. Yeah, the Folia used to be a Spanish or Portuguese dance, and it's one of those bass lines, ostinato, bass grounds, and many composers wrote Folia pieces. I mean, in the Romantic era and even later. And again, this is the concept. Geminiani, he arranged it's a solo violin piece, the Folia by Corelli, and he made it into a concerto grosso. So he changed the structure again, ripieno against a concertino. Yeah. But let's talk about the Wagner.
Yeah, the Wagner. Carolyn, you probably have some instruments in our collection that would be very relevant to this. The Concerto Köln is doing an amazing project, the Wagner Readings, which is a multi-year project that I'd like you to describe and then talk more about instruments.
Early music groups are expanding the repertoires in the last decades, and of course, the core repertoire for us is the Romantic and especially the Italian repertoire. But we play, of course, we play Mozart, the classical era. We played Mendelssohn. We did the Brahms German Requiem on period instruments of those days, and our new endeavor is really to have the first ring cycle by Richard Wagner on the appropriate instruments. And so far, I mean, we have to find fundings for that, of course. But we did 3 concerts with Romantic repertoire together with Kent Nagano, who loves this project, and he's conducting. And he's the brain of the whole challenge. And the thing is, it's never been done a ring on the appropriate instruments, and we are aiming for the Bayreuth setup. There are not that many sources for the premiere of the ring, but there are many sources of the premiere of Parzival, which were a little later. So we are aiming for the instruments of the Munich Court Orchestra of 1880. And there are many sources, and we know exactly what wind instruments were used in those days. We know what pitch. This was a diapason normal. This was a pitch 435 hertz. So nowadays, especially the American orchestras are really 443 hertz. In the Baroque age, I mean, we use now 415 hertz. So in those days, the European orchestras agreed slowly on a common pitch, and this was the diapason normal. And those instruments mainly don't exist anymore. I mean, we have some early bassoons, original early Heckel bassoons, we are using them. But we have the oboes rebuilt. This is instrument maker from Munich in those days, Ottensteiner. And there are some oboes kept in museums, of course, but you can't play them anymore. So we have them rebuilt. So we're aiming for the original instruments of the Munich court orchestra, which played in Bayreuth in those days.
So, yeah, 2.
Yeah, the brass, it's a little easier with the brass because those instruments are playable quite often. But we have to think about the Wagner tubes, Wagner Tuben, which is an instrument that Wagner created with instrument makers. And this is a really tricky point because the instrument was not perfect in Wagner's days. So it was a sort of tryout when he employed those instruments in the ring. So this is really, we have a research work on that point, and there's a doctorate and researchers on those topics, the instruments, and of course the singers. I mean, we are looking for the cast now, and the chances to go back to the roots. I mean, this was what Kent says. He's done the ring cycle like 20 or 25 times, and he thinks really this is, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to have the orchestra even bigger and more brilliant, and the opera houses grew bigger. And he really wants to go back to the roots. And the chances, when we have an orchestra with period instruments, which make a much more subtle and intimate sound, then the singers have much more freedom to come across this. I mean, we're not talking about thin voices. It still needs big voices, but they have the chance to focus more, and they don't need such a big vibrato. In the strings, we are basically playing non-vibrato with the romantic repertoire, but have portamento style. This is to join the notes, big gaps and leaps by a subtle glissando, and this is a stylistic device which is widely described in Wagner's and his contemporaries.
You know, we talked for a moment. I was thinking, if you give your microphone to Carolyn, and then I'll pass mine to you. We talked briefly a moment ago about, you were saying Joachim was also interested in vibrato at this time. So I wanted to start with that, and then Carolyn, I wanted to say for you, she's just done a remarkable study. She is in the process of doing a remarkable study of the Laurent flutes that the library holds. And this is a very scientifically fascinating thing, just as what you're doing with the Wagner. And I realize you're also working with your Ministry of Science and Culture in this, which is kind of, and that's kind of what you're doing. So I'm going to pass this over.
Well, I just want to know, after you do your premiere of The Ring,
Yeah.
are you going to come to America? I'm sorry you can't do it here in Coolidge Auditorium, but...
I mean, we have presented the project at the Lincoln Center, of course.
Okay.
Yeah. But let us practice first.
No, I'm just looking forward to it, to hear it,
Yeah.
you know.
It's an adventure.
It's staging
of course,
too, right? You're looking into the whole panoply of everything
of course.
about it.
I mean, talking about the vibrato, when Schunske was trying the Joachim, no, it was the violin played by Kreisler.
The Chrysler
The
Guarneri.
Kreisler
yes.
Guarneri. He employed a very little vibrato. I mean, nowadays when you watch the modern symphony orchestras, they have a permanent vibrato and quite wide, quite big. And in those days, the vibrato was really narrow in a way and more focused. And Schunske can really do that. I mean, he's able to have many varieties of vibrato. And of course, the soloists, they use vibrato. I was talking about the orchestra style. And we found sources that show clearly that vibrato in the orchestra, in the tutti section, was only used when it said dolce or espressivo. This was a sign of employ vibrato. But apart from that, it's a non-vibrato sound. Yeah.
Carolyn, tell about a little bit of your scientific studies.
I don't want to. I just had one more. I had to do a shout out to Thomas Jefferson, though. We have to tell you that in the Jefferson Library here at the Library of Congress, there's a Geminiani, The Art of Playing on the Violin. We have that copy that was Thomas Jefferson's. He was a violin player. And there's an annotation by Burney in that book. Just my little plug for
It's an important violin school by Geminiani. Of course, we have read that, but I have not touched the original.
We have the original copy here, The Many Riches.
And so the one question we both had sort of in mind for you is, what is the role of a period instrument in at this time? What is your next move and so on?
You mean what?
For you.
What are we aiming
Concerto
for?
Köln. Yeah, what will be your next ventures?
I mean, we always try to have composers back on stage, which are not known. We are doing research work now on Sammartini, which is a composer between the Baroque and the Classic era. And of course we do play the main repertoire, but still there's something to explore. I mean, the amount of improvisation, this is a thing that music colleges must be aware of, that in those days the soloist used to improvise. You can hear that in the organ concerto, which is played on the harpsichord tonight by Handel. And you said that it was actually as an intermezzo played between the acts of a Handel opera in the opera house. It was incidental music. And there are written parts or printed parts with the orchestra parts, and the solo part is only, there are few bars, a few measures, and then it's nothing. And this shows that Handel loved to improvise his solo line. And Artem, our harpsichord player, he does a little improvisation in the beginning of the concerto, and in the slow movement, he basically improvises. And so we think the written music which came upon us is only a framework we have to fill with flesh. And so it's to our taste, it's no point to play note by note as written in the score. No baroque virtuoso would have done that. So we're looking for our own interpretations, and this is a pretty big amount of improvising. Yes.
It's amazing, really, what you take on, how you continue to grow and make all these new ventures and ideas, explorations. You have an extraordinary explorer spirit in your ensemble. So back to the instruments just for a moment. Would it have been a normal thing for players to swap off like this? I mean, this is pretty rare. You're very daring guys.
I mean, in a way, it's daring to play those fine instruments tonight in a concert with just a half an hour.
We had to keep the whole
hour rehearsal. So this is a daring thing, and I'm sure it needs much more time, hours and hours work to explore the range of the Stradivari cello, of course. So this is just an experiment.
But they really pay off. They really pay. No, I mean, I'm teasing you, but if anyone can do this beautifully,
thanks.
Of course. But in your experience, Caroline, when people pick them up who are masters of this technique and so on, regardless of the setup and so on, don't they just respond more?
Absolutely. I mean, you came in here and within minutes, you know, you were exploring the sound on each note, on each string. You were just listening, you know, so intently, and you spent like 20 minutes really understanding, but there was no doubt in your mind once you started playing it and you were here just rehearsing with it, and then you looked up and said, "Can I play it tonight?" You know, it worked. There wasn't with you. And I've found that a lot with cello in particular. I don't know, how did you feel, like, when did you feel like, I mean, it must be a daunting thing to come here, show up and say, "Oh, can I play on this instrument?" You know?
It is a daring thing, so
no, not daring, daunting.
I shouldn't do that, but I mean, playing on an instrument like that is a lifelong journey, of course, to explore the possibilities, and it's like a marriage, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Quite a dance.
Well, I know that Alexander has to prepare to perform. If we could take maybe just 2 questions and then let him get it. Yeah. Anybody have a particular one in mind?
Yes, please.
Someone.
Can you tell us some more about what a period-appropriate string instrument would be for Wagner? What the difference would be between that and a modern violin, say?
Yeah. So they played the same instruments we do. I mean, they played instruments from the Baroque age, from the classical age. They still had gut strings, but I'm talking about the cello. The top 2 strings are blank gut strings, and the 2 bass strings are wound with a silver wire, which became flat after a while. The cellos some had still no spike, no end pin. Some had that already. This was a time of change. So there were orchestra players who were old-fashioned in a way, who kept playing without spike, and who kept the old classical bows. and the way of playing. And there were players who, of course, used the now modern bow, who used an end pin. To prepare for the Wagner project, we analyzed the early videos. I mean, you have them all on YouTube. You have at least the sound. You have Joachim on YouTube. You have the early Sarasate. You have the Wieniawski. And even there are some videos, early videos from, I think, the 20s, from Dresden and from Munich. And you can tell what player is, in a way, old-fashioned and the players who adapted to the modern technique. So this is, it was not that uniform than in a modern orchestra nowadays. But we are doing that. We're doing the top strings, gut strings without wire and the bottom strings with wire. And we have a early modern bow. Yeah.
Thank you.
Similar sort of movement like that, and when it comes to early music, because we're really kind of restricted to the East Coast, the West Coast, and a couple of islands between here and there, sort of thing. And you know, you come here with a lot of depth behind you. How do you see the, if you can say, the profession of early music performance?
I think nowadays young musicians who embark for a professional career, they can really choose what style of playing they want to learn. And luckily there are many colleges now who have an early music department. I mean, back like 30, 40 years, there were only two beacon colleges. This was Amsterdam, maybe The Hague, and Basel in Switzerland, who were really busy with research and early music. But nowadays there are many colleges in Germany and in Europe who offer an early music course. I mean, of course, England was always on the front of early music, but now it's in Cologne, in Munich, Leipzig, Berlin. You can study period instruments there. And I think the Juilliard School has its early music department since 10 years now. So you are having a development in the United States.
Very much.
And I mean, playing John Elliott Gardiner tours now the US with his Beethoven cycle. And I think this is done for the first time. I mean, he does in a row, in 3 or 4 days, he does all the Beethoven symphonies in Chicago. And I don't know where else. This is the first time it's done in the US, yes.
But you see good development in school. Students are signing up to take the programs. They think they can make a go of it and make a living of it.
I mean, to make a living from that, I mean, you have to be very flexible. And many players are really able to swap between the modern metal strings and on the other night they play the gut strings. I think you have to have this flexibility. Yeah. But I mean, the orchestras and the modern symphony orchestra are open to early music conductors. They invite Reinhard Goebel or Gardiner are invited to perform a classical or even a baroque program within a symphony orchestra. So there are no borders anymore between those two ways of performing, luckily.
Yes, Ton Koopman was an amazing conductor here recently with the NSO. It was just marvelous. And he brought out all these things you never hear that in a normal performance with regular conductors. Well, I think that might do it. Maybe, what do you think?
Thanks a lot for having me. Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.